What were the tactics that enabled the outnumbered Marines under Merritt Edson to hold the key terrain to the south of Henderson Field? We look at the attacks conducted by the Kawaguchi detachment and the defence put up by the Marines fighting with Merritt Edson on Edson's Ridge.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Principles of War podcast. This episode, number 140, is the 6th episode in our Guadalcanal campaign series with Dave Holland. Let's get right back into it. Dave is talking us through how Merritt Edson is going to lay out his defences. Like many tactical problems, there's a lot of terrain and there aren't enough troops. So how does he solve that problem?
Yeah, so the way he set his defences out, he didn't have enough guys to have a continuous line, and he wanted a defense in depth. So when I used to take, especially Australian NCOs and officers and QE NCOs and officers there for battlefield studies, I'd always use Edson's Ridge as a great battlefield study because it's very compact and it basically looks the same way. It's a good study in terrain, especially from a battalion and commander, company, and on downwards study. So he had a parachute battalion. The death study said parachute battalion, there were only about 300 guys. He had about 500. So he had a total of about 800 and maybe 830 Marines. So he couldn't have three continuous lines. So what he did, he had three lines. He put three companies on the front line. And that was on the first hill. He had two on a hill, and then he had another one between the hill and the Lunga River. So the Lunga River was probably about 500 yards to their west. He had one in the thick, swampy terrain, thick jungle. And then he had three succession lines. He had another one about 300 yards out in the middle spur. Then they had hill 2, we call it, which is the highest one. And he had a line there. You got to remember, then another spur, probably about 500 yards behind him, was the 1st Marine Division command post spur. So you had three lines there. Limited amount of barbed wire. Now, in the thick jungles, there were a couple of native trails running through. So he's covered those trails in platoon-size elements. So platoons would do like an all-around defense, covering the avenues approach with platoons all-around defense. And the commands they were given is try to, if possible, this was after this battle. This all changed, and we'll talk about that later. But yeah, that was what he had. Now, the big force multiplier we'll see in this whole campaign is the Marine artillery. Brigadier General, wasn't a Brigadier General yet. That was another 2 weeks. Colonel Pedro Deval, who was the artillery commander of the division, came up and personally registered some of the artillery there. So the Marines brought up a whole battery of 75s on the spur near, not for direct fire, well, it could be if need be, but right on the reverse slope. So brought right up to the ridge itself. The 105s were brought up near the airfield, 105 battalion. So you had basically 2 battalions of artillery, the 75s and 105s, in direct support, and they pre-registered all their fire that day on the 12th, early in the morning, just waiting. So that was all pre-registered, ready to go. But the thick jungle on both sides were going to be their ally, and they were going to try to channelize the Japanese into some kill zones. And if you've seen that thick jungle, anyone that says, "Oh, why couldn't it go around?" You never walked into that thick jungle before. I could take 50 guys in daylight and say you got to go 100 meters. I want you to stay together as a cohesive group, or I doubt all 50 get there. Or if I do at night, you definitely won't. So that was the Marines' defenses they had ready to go. And then they had only one battalion as a battalion reserve, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, ready to react. And like I said before, they had 2 whole companies of M3 Stuart light tanks or M2 light tanks, and a few other provisional companies ready to go if need be. Yeah, so that was the defenses they had.
So how did Kawaguchi move to contact it?
He wanted all 3 battalions to attack on line. Because at that stage, he knew that, okay, that if the Marines have manned the place, we've got our scouts out. So what do you want to do? Typical Japanese infiltration techniques, we're going to go around. So they're going to go in the thick jungle between the ridge and the Lunga River. That was going to be 1 battalion through there. Another battalion is going to go up on the ridge, and one was going to flank to the right. He was going to attack in columns of battalions. So the 2 battalions are going to go up, try to infiltrate, like typical Japanese tactics. Once they find a way around, the rear column, the support column, used to call it, a battalion would just go off right left or right, whichever way that lead one went around, path of least resistance. So that was the plan. So the early evening of the 12th, the Japanese naval bombardment occurred. She had, I think, 1 cruiser and 3 destroyers with searchlights now. They put the searchlights on the ridge and started bombarding the ridge. But unfortunately for the Japanese, most of the rounds went overshot and actually landed closest where the Japanese simile points were. So didn't do them too well. A bit frustrating. It get late at night. His units were not even up. Only one unit was even near the line of departure. The other two were still in the jungle trying to grope their way through. So the unit on the left, he says, attack. So they attacked. So he only attacked one battalion. So they pushed through, went around Hill 1, through between Hill 1, which I said Hill 1's the first hill of Bloody Ridge, and Lunga. And he had C Company Raiders in there, and they end up infiltrating through. Good small unit tactics by the Japanese. Good infiltration tactics. They cut off a couple of platoons. Another platoon got overran. Yeah, so the C Company Raiders had to pull back. So they fought all night. The Raiders on the ridge didn't know what was happening below them. They're just waiting. Then when morning time came, the Japanese had penetrated probably about 300 yards into the Marines' right flank in the thick jungle, and they held there. So Kawaguchi, his 2 units hadn't been committed yet. So that was the first night. Yeah, so in the early morning, Edson was faced with his front line. His right side was was refused, and the Japanese had penetrated. He had 3 lines. So he says, so he didn't know the Japanese didn't have enough guys to attack that night. He knew how many Japanese there were, and he thought they were probing them. He goes, last night was just a probe. They're going to hit us with everything they got tonight. And my right-hand side is already pulled back, and I've got 2 exposed companies up in the front ridge. So if they attack, they're going to come straight through and cut these guys off. So what he did was a brilliant plan. He moved his front line to the second line. So what that did, that opened up 400 yards of basically killing ground. And then he gave instructions that we'll form a last line of defense around this hill. We'll let them infiltrate around us, but we're not moving. We're not retreating anywhere. The guys behind us can clean up the stragglers, but we'll defend and die here if we have to. So early that morning, they tried to do a bit of a push for one of his companies to push the Japanese out of thick jungle, but they were too entrenched. So he pulled back, and they dug in and registered more fire through that day and got ready for that massive assault that night. That did occur. And by that stage, when the nighttime came, there was another naval bombardment, overshot by 7 destroyers. And the Japanese this time had planned to just do the same technique. So that started when nighttime come there. Japanese pushed the second line back, and the Marines formed basically a last-ditch defense around Hill 2. This was only 2 Japanese battalions. Kawaguchi's largest battalion was still moping around in the jungle, lost. In fact, at one stage, you're going parallel to the Marine lines. They were just completely lost, and Kawaguchi was so frustrated. And you got to remember, what happens about these other 2 diversionary assaults? They're not occurring on the first night. They didn't occur. They couldn't coordinate it. So nothing happened on the assaults. On the second night, the Kuma battalion got into the fight, but they were repulsed quite easily on the Marines' right flank by 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines. Then the 14th, which is a day later, Oka finally got into it, and they were repulsed. So piecemeal assaults. So that was these diversionary attacks. So that night, after the Marine artillery was really pounding the Japanese pretty hard, at one stage, they were walking artillery back and forth, 75s within 50 yards of the Marine lines. The 105s were shooting it over and hitting the assembly points, and they weren't even being called in. One FO said he could hear the screams of the Japanese, and they just poured on more. But the artillery was firing so hard that some of the charging Japanese were running into the Marine, against the Marine hills to escape the artillery landing amongst them. So they're running up these steep hills, trying to infiltrate around, but as soon as the flares would go off, it'd hit the hill, and that's where the Japanese mass assaults up, trying to go up this hill. Marines were throwing loads of grenades, machine gun fire, some of the positions, hand-to-hand fire, back and forth, the assaults. In one stage, the Japanese took positions on the Marine left. Edson yelled out to the battalion commander of the parachute guys, trying to find him, couldn't find him. There was a captain, company commander, and he goes, "Where's your battalion commander?" "I don't know." He goes, "Well, you're battalion commander now. I'll take you 2 companies and get those people out of that ravine." So they fixed bayonets and pushed the Japanese out of the ravine. It was just stuff going left and right. To his credit, Vandergrift remained in his command post. He's like, I made my bed. I got to lie in it. And I've verified this. Sometimes you hear these sea stories about how things happen. But Sergeant Major, he's a warrant officer then, Chief of Warrant Officer, Sheffield Banta. It's something like you see that movie, We Were Soldiers one. He's in a command post, and a Japanese officer and 2 Japanese had penetrated the command post, killed a gunnery sergeant at the tent at the door or the area, had penetrated in. They shot one of the guys shot one of the Japanese down. One of the Japanese got within feet of Vandegrift, and Sheffield Banta shot one with a 45, killed him. And the other was rolling around the ground with another Marine. So Bantas went up and pointed point blank, shot that guy in the head point blank. The old sea story was the sergeant major, or Banta, was chewing the Marine's butt for some infraction. Japanese run in, he killed both of them. Then he started chewing the Marine again. He started getting, you obviously know how, but yeah, that was a true story about him killing the Japanese, and Japanese penetrating the command post. That's how close it was. So this ebbed and flowed all night long with the artillery landing. And at one stage, the Marines were starting to bug out, they call it, or leave on the left flank. And Edson was only 10 yards from the forward position. Sometimes it was an ammunition box. He'd stand on an ammunition box. At other times, he'd lay down and call in fire himself. But bullets are zipping all around him. Guys are getting shot left around him. So he's up there inspiring them in. And then in one stage, the group of Marines started to book out, because apparently it was a combination of Japanese smoke, puric acid, which is the chemical in the Japanese detonators, and plus, I don't know if it's true, but Japanese word for charge sounds like gas. And some of the Marines start thinking about gas, or they're in gas masks, and I think, plus the whole pressure of the fight, some of them started to leave. And that's when Edson and a guy called Bailey, which I'll talk about him in a second, Major Bailey of the staff, got involved and physically. I think Bailey was actually kicking guys in the rear, and guns were coming out, and they were threatening. I mean, I think Edson basically said, those men over there talking about Japanese have more than you do. They have guts. He said, you call yourselves Marines. He said, if you're going to die, you're going to die in your hose. That's where you're going to go back in your hose. You're going to die. You're going to die there, but they're not getting through us. I'm yelling at them like that. But yeah, they held. And there's all kinds of words that's happening. Some Japanese infiltrated through. About one group made it to, one company actually made it, or a partial company made it to the nearby Fighter 1 where they're building. But the Marines had engineers there too. They end up counterattacking and wiping those Japanese out. The thing about Edson's Ridge, a lot of people don't realize, the things about the Raiders, the Parrot Marines, the 1st Engineer Battalion had an old company there. And then about 4 o'clock in the morning, the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines came in and started getting into the fight. The reserves were calling up. So there was a lot of Marines there other than just the Raiders and the Parrot Marines. But they held. Artillery was a big factor. And plus the determination of the Marines there. But to me, the artillery won that battle. It smashed the Japanese. And Japanese actually, at one stage, said one Japanese survivor, company commander, said basically his company was wiped out in an assembly point. And he called them the Americans automatic cannons. They were firing automatic cannons on it.
That's an impressive testament to the power of indirect fire, and also the number of tubes that they would have had being able to interdict that battle for them to think that they are automatic. So just having a look at the map, the divisional CP is about 500 yards from Hill 2, maybe a little bit further. So that it does show just how confused the battle was, that even just a couple of soldiers were able to get that far behind the main defensive position on Hill 2.
Yeah, I mean, it's very thick jungle. I mean, they didn't have a solid line. The Americans did. In fact, almost a week later, they were still killing stragglers, and Japanese sniper rounds were flying around because some of the Japanese, after didn't retreat back, they're still stuck in the jungle, caught and firing rounds.
What about the actions of Ken Bailey on that second night?
Yeah, so Ken Bailey, I think I mentioned him in episode 1. I think I did. I said, or episode 2 about Tulagi. I said, remember this guy. He was the commander of C Company of the 1st Raider Battalion. He was wounded in Tulagi, taking out that bunker, and he shot in the thigh. So you sent him back to New Caledonia. And there he was, healing up, and he was giving talks to the Army there. And a lot of them, you see in their letters and their memoirs, they're talking about Bailey. They just said he was impressive, and they'd learned a lot from him. Anyway, he was there, and he heard his Raiders were potentially going to get into a fight, and they were fighting on Guadalcanal. So being a good commander, he goes to the medical doctor, Navy medical doctor, he goes, I want to go back. I mean, you can't, your leg's not healed. And he goes, yeah, okay. Next minute, he boards a cargo plane. I said these cargo planes are going in. He boards a cargo plane and carrying a bag of mail that the Raiders, their first mail. So he comes, lands, walks out. He's 6'3". Comes walking out. He's wearing his white tennis shoes, hospital tennis shoes, because they cut his boots off. He didn't have any. He's like white tennis shoes in his uniform, where they're carrying a bag of mail. He's walked up on the 12th now. This is the day of the battle. He's walked up and a big greeting back. The C Company already had a commander. He'd been replaced. So Edson says, well, I want you on my staff. You can just stay up here with me and help me out. You see some accounts, they say, Bailey was the C Company commander during the battle. No, he wasn't. But anyway, during the battle, he's running back and forth. It's like every memoir he's talked to vets. They said, well, Bailey was with me over in this flank. He go, no, Bailey was us on this flank. Or Bailey was with us in the middle. Well, he was. He was moving back and forth. He's running back and getting grenades because they're using boxes of grenades. He's jumping in Jeeps and grabbing grenades. He's making sure to distribute him. He's helping Edson out as much as he can. He's inspiring the men. He's filling in when he has to. So he's all over the place. And all the veterans talk about how inspiring Ken Bailey was that night. He was slightly wounded in the hip. And and then at the end of the battle, he's got this big bandage on his head and no helmet on. And and he and Edson were both later nominated for Medal of Honor for their actions during the battle. And both Steve and Bailey posthumously. And we'll talk about later. He dies in the campaign. But Bailey was a larger than life figure. Very aggressive, both on and off the field, so to speak. Used to get in trouble a bit.
Particularly, I think one of the actions that's very impressive is he didn't need to be in that battle. He was told not to be in that battle, and yet he disobeyed orders so that he could be with his soldiers in that battle.
Brought him mail. Exactly. Firing later. Right after the battle, and we'll talk about it later, that Edson goes to the 5th Marine Regiment. He gets given command of the 5th Marine Regiment, and Bailey moves up to be the executive officer of the Raider Battalion. Sam Griffin, who's the executive officer, takes command. So, the battle, casualty-wise, there were roughly sometimes Japanese figures, you can't really put a finger on it. Different reports vary. I look at American figures like anything inflate. A lot of times these body counts are inflated. Estimate. Every time I read that when I'm doing my research or writing something, I always try to compare it to Japanese records. And comparison, and Richard Frank's done a good comparison also. Roughly about 800 Japanese had died, were killed, and obviously a larger number would. Now, the Americans lost about 112. We're talking about for the whole 3 days, killed, and over 200 wounded. Bloody Ridge itself, on Edson's Ridge, I think they lost 53. It's like 53 and had like 200 and plus wounded. If you're looking at having 800 guys in the battle, maybe 850 on Edson's Ridge, and losing 250 casualties, that's a pretty high casualty rate the Marines suffered. And obviously the Japanese did too. So after that, the Japanese, on the last day, on the 15th, this is a good little story, the Japanese were forming up, getting their guys back. Kawaguchi already issued orders, okay, let's move back to the move toward the Guadalcanal. So now they're going in the opposite direction to meet up with the forces there. So they're forming on the backside. This is daytime, on the backside of some of their assembly points, away from American view. 3 P-400s, the converted P-39s, flew over. And Bailey said, Ashley, his recommendation, he said, can we get some guys up there? I think the wheels were still down. They flew out and they strafed these Japanese and killed quite a bit of them. And then I think they made a few runs. And when they landed, I think, was it Vandergrift? I got to double check this. I think he had some spare bottles of scotch or bourbon or something he had hidden. Get off a Navy ship, they gave him to him, and he just presented them with him. He goes, don't tell the boys this. And he handed them bottles of scotch or whatever for they did the P-400. Because they wasn't great for dogfighting, but great for strafing and shooting up boats. But so Kawaguchi and his men started retreating back down the Lunga, then a place called East-West Trail, and started cutting back toward the Guadalcanal, heading west. And that ended the battle of Edson's Ridge or Bloody Ridge or the Ridge. And today it's called Bloody Ridge, but the Marines generally call it Edson's Ridge or Raiders Ridge or the Ridge, the effing place or whatever.
From my point of view, one of the big things that really sticks in my mind is just the large number of charges that were made from Hill 1 to Hill 2 by the Japanese. So they had done such a great job of infiltrating, and the fact that some soldiers were actually able to get to Fighter 1, and yet they stuck methodically to repeated charges over what was really fantastic ground for a defender.
Yeah, I think because once again, when they rushed in groups. And it's like we're talking about Alligator Creek, and they find bravery in groups. If you can't rush, if there's a group of you rushing, if you can rush against machine gun fire, it's better to be in a group, so to speak. I mean, I'm not saying not for the fire because you get shot up. It's just to build courage, because they're not all fanatical guys you don't have no feelings. I mean, these are Japanese human soldiers. So at night, safety in numbers, or I think security, it felt secure and safe in groups. So if the group's like the group mentality, sort of mob mentality, and they just go with them. I'm not saying they're a mob, but I think that's some of the things you'll see rather than trying to infiltrate through a thick jungle, and it only breaks up to 4 or 5 guys. I mean, if they find a trail, which some of them did, I think that's how they penetrated. We'll see later in the Battle of Henderson Field, they try to penetrate down trails, and they ran straight in 37 millimeter anti-tank guns. Yes, so yeah, it was like, but once again, that artillery is firing so much.
We've talked about the American artillery. Did the Japanese have any artillery supporting them?
There's always a report that there was a 75 millimeter mountain howitzer taking up the Hill 1, and the next day, and I've seen the official report by a guy called Torgerson. He was the captain in the parachute battalion, and his report actually says that they found the 75 millimeter on Hill 1 with a number of shell casings unfired, but the primers dented in. So it looked like it had a bad firing pin on the gun or something, which I tend to believe that. He said it. I mean, it's an official report. I haven't seen it corroborated anywhere else, but I know they had at least 2 guns they man-packed in. You could just, if that was true, you could just imagine the frustration of the gunner. You haul that gun all the way through the jungle. You get it up there. Okay, now we got them in our sights. These 600 yards to Hill 1 to Hill 2. Start firing, direct fire. All of a sudden, click, down, put it away, click, down. Imagine the frustration of those guys. Most frustrated man I think ever in Guadalcanal, if that was true. Yeah, but yeah, they didn't have much artillery. Like I said, they used the benefit of naval gunfire was supposed to be their main hit, which good plan. But once again, they didn't have any FOs, forward observers up there. So they just said, there's the ridge, shoot at it. A lot of overshots.
And that was what I was thinking. They probably had no comms with the Navy, so there was no adjusting, which makes it very difficult.
As you know, calling naval gunfire is a bit different from calling in normal artillery fire. You really got to factor in elevation. I remember that when I was doing the FO stuff. Elevation, because you're firing at sea level.
Well, and critically, the attacking from the south, that would make it very difficult to manage any of the overs that would go over the ridgeline, because that would probably come straight at you.
They couldn't stop them. It's like, gee.
So what were the implications for the Marine victory for the campaign?
I had major implications for the campaign. Once again, it boasted the Marines' confidence. This is the second battle that they defeated the Japanese pretty hard. Japanese came close to, I wouldn't say winning this battle, because once again, that's a big what if. I've read a couple of accounts that if the Japanese would have pushed the Marines off the ridge and taken the airfield, it would have been all over, which I disagree, because the Japanese had no follow-on forces, and any of them that actually reached the airfield, they had no supply, no follow-on forces, and there were contingency plans in place. So you had the 1st Marines and the 5th Marines, like Hunt or Cates, the regional commander of the 1st Marines, had a whole battalion ready to go for counterattack. Then you had all these small groups, even like artillery, you had air crew, air personnel, you had headquarters personnel, you had all those guys ready to go in provincial platoons. You had 2 tank companies ready to do a counterattack. You had a few companies of the 5th Marines on the other side, because if they did take it, they would have been wiped out within hours, I'd say. So, but the implications, once again, it boosted the morale. They beat them twice. Things was looking good for them. It didn't really, I guess, spur on the American command to say, look, send more troops in there, because once again, the Irish Army didn't have any troops to spare. They're all guarding that vital Australian-American supply line. Even though that Major General Harmon, the Army commander in the South Pacific, was screaming, yelling, wanting more troops there. But it didn't really boost reinforcements. They didn't say FDR and the rest of them go, this is now, we're going to send everything here. But on the Japanese side, it did. Japanese had an emergency meeting on the 16th, I think, or maybe late 15th. Imperial Japanese High Command had an emergency meeting and said, these guys have been defeated. Now, obviously, the Americans are here. And this is when they first realized, and this is when you're starting to see in official Japanese communications about they talk about decisive battle. They're starting to recognize, okay, now the Americans want to fight a decisive battle, because, all the Japanese all about this decisive battle. And they want to do it at Guadalcanal. All right, fine. Now we're going to form plans, and we're going to do this once and for all. Major fleet, another division, we're going to go down there and do this. We're going to wipe the Americans out. But resource-wise, hold on a minute. We've got fighting a campaign in Papua New Guinea at this stage. That's our main area. We want to take Port Moresby. We've got guys fighting over Kokoda, the track at this moment, pushing on to we're close to Moresby's now. We've already diverted some reinforcements from them. Imperial Japanese High Command goes, okay, suspend all operations, offensive operations in Port Moresby in New Guinea. Everything we got's going to Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal is going to be our main focus. Once we wipe these Americans out of Guadalcanal, then we're going to shift back to go to New Guinea. Guys in New Guinea, hold, and we'll come to you when we come to you, so to speak. Hayakataki, you're the Army commander. You're going to move your office from Rabaul. You're going straight to Guadalcanal. You can run both campaigns. Well, sorry, there's only one campaign. The Japanese looked at it. We should have, but I consider them both the same campaign. Japanese did. They're going to tell Hayakataki, you're going to run the Kokoda campaign. I forgot what they called it. We're going to run the campaign in New Guinea, and you're going to run the campaign in Guadalcanal at the same time. At that stage, you had a staff of about 5 or 6 people. We're going to beef you up by 8 or 9 more people. And that's it. That was the major shift. And then that had a major impact, as you can imagine, especially in the South Pacific, Southwest Pacific, and how the victory at Edson's Ridge impacted the Australians' campaign, the Japanese campaign at Port Moresby, and also shifted other forces. Now the Japanese are going to focus on Guadalcanal, and it really made the Japanese set up and look. I had read some accounts that impacted some of the even in the Indian Ocean, but I can't think off the top of my head how that did it. But I read an account one time how some of the forces were diverted. And also some of the forces were starting being diverted from elsewhere. They're starting to send them to the South Pacific, Southwest Pacific. Not that much, but I think there was 2 divisions diverted to head to the South Pacific to Guadalcanal. And the combined fleet started gathering up, started getting them a very big interest, because they said, look, the Americans are potentially going to put their fleet here, and we can, Yamamoto said this is the time we can potentially do a decisive fleet battle too. And that's when we're starting to lead up into October. They're getting ready for Operation X, their massive assault to take back Guadalcanal. So yeah, it had major implications to the Japanese and the whole Pacific War. For after that, it shifted about.
I think it's fascinating that the IGA's 17th Army would move their headquarters to Guadalcanal, because that's effectively, and it's only got 5 people, they're bolstering it with another 7 or 8 officers.
The Corps, Western Corps size, yeah.
Even then.
It's a company that's bigger than a company, a normal company headquarters. Definitely battalion headquarters is more than that, more than 11 people.
And they would have been doing it in austere conditions. It's effectively a tactical headquarters, and yet they're responsible for 2 campaigns.
Yeah, he's in a jungle ravine, especially toward the latter part of the campaign. He was in a cave, they called it, like a cave underneath a bank of a stream bank with a hooch over top of it.
I'm all for smaller headquarters, but I think they might have gone a little bit too far there. And because comms, how would he have been able to speak to his subordinates on Guadalcanal, let alone in New Guinea?
Yeah, so they had long-range radios to Rabaul. So everything went to Rabaul, then went back. So they had a pretty good comms to Rabaul all the way up to the very end of the campaign. They started losing a bit of comms there because they lost not so much comms, they lost personnel to run it. They were dying. They run a lot on, like the Americans did, on field phones. You see a lot of Japanese field phone wire. In fact, they used the Japanese field phone wire to make makeshift stretchers. They used to love that because it's a pretty strong wire. I was reading an account by the bandsman, and I think 25th Division, they made all their stretchers off using, they bind them together with Japanese comm wire. It was pretty good.
So what were the lessons that were learnt then on both sides of the combat? What did the Marines take out of it? What did they realise that they needed to improve? And for the Japanese at the tactical level, what were they thinking?
Yeah, so the Marines, we're starting to see, I think when the 7th Marines come in for probably the next episode, I'll talk about the defense strategy and how they set up a cordon defense rather than a defense in depth. But what it did, it showed the power of the Japanese infiltration techniques, how to potentially counter them by remaining in place. So if you remain in place and form an all-around defense, just let the Japanese pass by you, and hopefully the people behind you will take them out. But if you stay there, you're going to counter their infiltration assaults because they'll probably focus on you after that. Another thing, it boasted some of the leaders, and you'll see, I'll talk about this now. On the 16th of September, there was a number of officers promoted to colonel. So Vandergrift had an excess amount of colonels. So I call it the Great September Purge. So what you see then, because at that stage they've landed, they've been there a month, they've fought 3 battles, you say in Tulagi, 3 battles, and mechanicals and all that, and they have a bit of a shakedown. So some of these officers and NCOs who weren't performing well, they were booted out. Some of these excess colonels, he says, "Oh, you're excess colonel now." He gave Vandergrift an excuse to get rid of him. I mean, his good friend was Colonel Hunt. He was the 5th Marine regimental commander, but he wasn't performing up to expectations. So he replaced him with Edson. So Edson took command of the 5th Marine. And you've seen some battalion commanders replaced, a lot of company commanders on downwards. So it was a bit of a shakedown. Started learning who could fight and who couldn't. Some guys getting promoted. Okay, this young guy can fight, lieutenant. Now you're the first lieutenant. You're the new company commander. Sergeant, you've got a temporary commission to lieutenant. Things like that. They started, private. Now you're a squad leader. Things like that. They started shaking down their course. So they're learning a lot from there. They're learning about how the enemy fights. And they've started learning more and more about their tactics and techniques, especially about supporting columns. They know the Japanese attack in columns. They generally have a support column behind them. They go, okay, what we'll do is we'll estimate where the support column is going to be in an attack. And we'll pre-register our fires in there. So every time we get hit, we'll just start hitting about 300 or 400 yards behind, hopefully catch out those supporting columns, which later in the campaign, it proved beneficial. Things like that. They started adapting to the Japanese techniques and learning. And they started modifying their own ways of doing things. Japanese, always slow to modify anything, their techniques. And generally, you don't see much modification at all on Japanese sides. One thing I did see in most of the reports, the Japanese still, even to the end of the campaign, I think end of the war, they don't value the American fighting man's ability, individual fighting ability. I don't know if it's just hubris or whatever, or arrogance or accommodation, but what they do respect, and you'll see in almost every report, is American artillery and mortars. Don't underestimate American firepower, be cautious about this. I've seen bulletins that tell the Japanese exactly do this, this, and this, or don't do this. And the Japanese forward commanders still do it in the battles. You'll see a big one, the 2nd Division. When they arrived on Guadalcanal, they had a big bulletin flyer. I've got it. It's about 15 pages long. It's made an assessment of who they're fighting, and it's passed along on to all the unit commanders. Don't do this, don't do that. There was one, I've got it in my book. He was Lieutenant General, Chief of Staff, I think, of the Imperial Japanese headquarters in Tokyo. And he gave a warning to the new commanders there. He said, don't underestimate these Americans. They're not a colonial army. We've been used to fighting. And he basically told them what to do and, be aware there are firepower and artillery and use close assault techniques and things like that, and use infiltration if you can, basic stuff they need to do. They know. But they didn't adopt their basic tactics, not on a tactical level. They didn't. They just continued to do what they wanted to do, which you'll see that Japanese throughout the war, very reluctant.
Well, that was what I was going to say. It is one of those very interesting things, and we talked briefly about Nomonhan before. They didn't really seem to take too much from Nomonhan.
They beat artillery in some of the divisions, I know that, in Nomonhan, and their anti-tank capability. That's about it.
Yeah, they probably needed a fundamental force redesign to be able to fight a battle like Nomonhan, and yet they never went through the academic rigor to be able to do that. And so they continued to fight and they continued to lose because the British, the Australians, and the United States all were learning, and they got better at learning as the infrastructure for those lessons learnt processes to be synthesized and promulgated out as in developing doctrine. The Japanese had none of that.
No. And you see them do change tactics. I mean, obviously the big fighting them at the beach tactic changed, especially around Peleliu. It shifted tactics and then let them come onto the beach to just fight a war of attrition on the defensive. But they're very, very reluctant to change. And you got to remember, too, in the first 7 months until they got to Guadalcanal, it was all victory fever. They said, well, why change what we've been doing? It's been working quite well. We defeated basically everyone in front of us. We've had some minor setbacks here and there, but yeah, we've done all right. So I think, and then you had some of the reluctance to speak up for the Japanese, especially some of the members. They spoke up, and as we'll see later with Kawaguchi, he speaks up after this battle later in the campaign, and they don't like it at all about trying to change techniques and tactics that are plans. And once a plan, as you know, in the Japanese, once a plan's set, that's basically it. It's no deviating because the plan's been set.
Yeah, not a lot of flexibility.
No, deep, especially a lot of centralization command. You read, but what's interesting, you read in the Japanese doctrine of the time and the training manuals, and I used to think the Japanese were offensively dumb. I honestly believed that until I started reading the Japanese techniques and reading the actual manuals from the day and some of the stuff they're doing. I switched on small units. But when it didn't go their way, that was it. They just couldn't think outside the square. So even though it actually says in the manuals that we, I forgot how they say it, but we promote initiative in the small units, and they don't promote initiative in the small unit. Well, you don't see it actually occurring on the battlefield. It doesn't work. You don't see a commander's intent pushed all the way down the small unit leaders like lieutenants and sergeants. They said, okay, instead of going here, we know the commander's intent. Things changed, fluidity of combat. Let's just switch on the fly and just, we know what our intent is. None of that. Well, he said, attack this hill. Okay, we'll attack this hill. We can go around this hill. But no, we're going to attack this hill. It's the last order I got. Things like that.
And I wonder what to degree that's because it was a less well-educated army and highly based around discipline.
Obedient, severely obedient. The whole thing is just designed into them. There's a story about Bloody Ridge. I don't know. I like to believe this. I don't know if it's a good Marine Sea story, but when daylight came on the 15th of September, at the end of Fighter 1, where they were building the airfield, there were 3 Japanese sitting there. And after they killed them, but the only thing they could work out, why did these guys sitting there? Either they wasn't that exhausted, they just gave up. And then some of the plans, apparently they found the rally point was if you make it through, form up at the end of this runway. That was what they've been told. So they formed up at the end of the runway, thousands of Marines around them. But I tend to believe that because that was kind of their mentality. Yeah, I haven't confirmed it in writing in a message. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. That's a very in-depth discussion about the actions on Edson's Ridge in that a pivotal battle in the Guadalcanal campaign on land. So thank you very much.
Oh, thanks again, James. Like I said, I could talk all day, but yeah, it's a very it's a good one to study. But once again, it isn't the turning point. I've heard it called the turning point of Guadalcanal campaign. No, it definitely helped. It's a very important battle, but once again, it's like Alligator Creek. It was a localized battle. There's larger battles to be fought in the campaign. So, yeah, but it's very, very important. But it wasn't the turning point, as people see it. Like we said before, the campaign isn't, the Marines fought Alligator Creek, Marines fought Bloody Ridge. Then it was over. The Army came in and just mopped up. Actually, some people actually believe that, which is entirely not true. And hopefully after listening to this podcast, they will know better.
Well, yeah, there's plenty more fighting to be done.
Yep. All right, James.
Thank you. And there we are, another fantastic episode with Dave Holland. He really is the expert when it comes to the battles on Guadalcanal. Don't forget to look for his book, Guadalcanal's Longest Fight, The Pivotal Battles on the Matanikaw Front. There's a couple of points I want to bring out about the Battle of Bloody Ridge. Firstly, it's a very terrain-driven battle. Check out the show notes or the YouTube video. We'll have some drone footage in there that will enable you to see just how terrain-driven this battle was and how well Edson was able to create an engagement area that made it very difficult for Kawaguchi's troops to get up that ridge. Once again, we see excellent use of the artillery in support of the Marines, excellent use of pre-registered artillery, so that those forces in echelon that are forming up for successive waves, they are receiving indirect fire. That is an excellent use of artillery because when that attack goes in, it will have been attrited. I've mentioned it before, the Marines are much more willing to go into all-round defence, and that makes it much more difficult for the Japanese infiltration tactics to work. They really do rely on causing troops to withdraw. Once they're up, moving out of their defensive positions, they start to take dramatically higher casualties. The Japanese infiltration tactics don't bring a lot of firepower with them, and it's harder to coordinate indirect fire support when they have it. This means that the task of the troops conducting the counter-penetration attacks is significantly easier. The difficulty, of course, is C2, especially when it's being done at night. Another important point, leadership skills when there's combat at night are at a premium. We see people like Ken Bailey and Merritt Edson. They're appearing everywhere on the position. They're resupplying soldiers, they're reassuring them, they're giving them situational awareness, and they're giving them an example of leadership that reassures them that they are doing the right thing. One of the actions that ensured that the Marines who were fighting at night were getting the leadership that they deserved, the leadership that they needed, was that Vandergrift had conducted the September purge. Those who weren't up to it were rotated into administrative roles so that they had fighting leaders to lead the soldiers in combat. Lastly, a point for the Japanese. We'd already spoken about the C2 issues that Kawaguchi had on the march up. Here we see the critical problem with coordination of the naval gunfire support. The guns of the ships off Lunga Point, they were big ships with big guns, throwing a lot of explosive downrange, and yet the Japanese just weren't able to get the full of shot accurate because there was no communication between the troops on the ground and the ships on the gun line. When we look at the Battle of Henderson Field, we will talk about the effect of naval gunfire support, and it's not too hard to imagine how different this battle would have been had there been a lot more accurate naval gunfire support provided by the ships. Another example of the difficulties of orchestrating effects with limited C2 capability. That's it for this week. Next week, we will return to discuss the second Battle of the Guadalcanal. If you're listening to the podcast and you haven't checked out our YouTube channel, jump on YouTube and search for the Principles of War and have a look. I think the videos there, we've got some really good images of the podcast that we've put up. I think it adds quite a bit to the understanding of the stories that are being told. If you've found us on YouTube, maybe you want to swing over and have a listen to the podcast. There's no video there, but it's perfect for when you're out and about jogging or walking the dog. So the podcast, 1.1 million downloads. So this is where it all started. And there's a lot more episodes on the podcast. We're slowly working our way through and putting the back catalogue up onto YouTube. That's it. We'll be back next week with Dave Holland and the Second Battle of the Guadalcanal.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.